All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. This week we are going to, in one way, continue our discussion of postmodernism that we've been undertaking for the last 2 weeks, but also move past or move through postmodernism to some related topics. So last week in particular, we were looking at postmodern fiction and discussing some of the ways in which its postmodern techniques of metafiction, of pastiche, of a combination of high and low culture, and even in some cases of a waning of affect, how these played into political themes. And we saw that probably most overtly in the work of Grace Paley and Ursula K. Le Guin, who both in Paley's Conversation with My Father and Le Guin's She Unnames Them and Schrodinger's Cat posit postmodern sensibilities as opening up a world of potential that's closely related to certain kinds of political liberation that they both tied to gender. And similarly, in Pynchon's work, where we saw in Entropy the sort of closed space of a kind of hierarchical imperial modernism dying upstairs and the open multiracial space of the party heading off chaos downstairs in the story Entropy. We saw that as also having political implications, and even in Philip K. Dick's Precious Artifact, a story of paranoia, we saw reflections on themes of war, imperialism, and related ideas. So we've been talking about that, but now I want to even more explicitly link the postmodern movement as it develops in the 1960s to the social movements of the 60s and the ones that followed them after in the 70s and 80s. So not everything we're going to be reading this week will be literature written in the 1960s, but I think is related to those social movements. And in fact, I think for the next 3 weeks, really, we're going to be dealing with this concept of these liberation movements, these social movements of feminism, civil rights, black power, gay liberation, anti-war, and then that will become a multicultural movement in the 70s, some of those things will. And so for the next 3 weeks, really, I think we're going to be exploring these topics of a literature that's attentive to politics, to issues of race, gender, class, sexuality, and other what has been called identity politics, a term I think we'll talk about next week. So that is the theme of beginning with this week's class, Liberation Literature, the 60s and After. And we will be looking at a number of writers in a number of genres who deal with these subjects. This week in particular, we're going to focus on poetry with Adrienne Rich and Lucille Clifton, and on nonfiction with Joan Didion and Ishmael Reed. So I just want to give a brief overview. I think this is a pretty well-known topic that you probably learned about somewhere else in your life in high school or some other college class. So I'm not going to go over this too in detail. This isn't a history class, but I just want to give a brief review of the social movements of the 1960s, particularly the later 1960s, to give you an idea of the background to this literature. And just as a footnote before I start, or a digression before I start, I don't know if you can digress before you've even begun, but I want to point out that when we say the 60s, one of the things you quickly find out when you study the academic humanities, whether that's history or literature or art history or philosophy, is that sometimes time designations are used to represent certain eras in which certain kinds of trends and feelings and movements dominated, and the time designation isn't that precise. And what I mean by that is when we talk about the 60s in quotation marks to talk about the period of these social movements, we're really not talking about the 1960 to 1969. We're talking about more of an atmosphere that existed in American life for about a decade. And really, the 60s in that in quotation mark sense goes from the late 60s through the early 70s. It's really something like 1967 to 1975 or something. So, and you see this all over the humanities. There's even phrases that scholars use to talk about well, somebody will say, I study the long 19th century, which begins in 1780 and is still going on, So the 19th century doesn't mean 1800 to 1899. It means something more. It means a kind of emotional atmosphere, a spiritual mood, a political tendency. And it's the same thing here with the 60s. And people often talk about the long 1960s as going from 1965 to 1975 or something. So that's just a brief note. And that's why I'm calling a lot of the literature of this week, literature of the 60s, when I think we're only reading like one or two things that was even written in the 60s. So anyway, that's just my digression. My digression is over. I want to just give a brief rundown of some, not all, and we'll talk about some of the ones that I'm not talking about this week later, but some of the social movements of the late 1960s. So you have, number one, the women's liberation movement. So that's in the 1960s, where you have the second wave of feminism. Feminism famously has waves, or comes in waves. And the first wave of feminism was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that focused on the movement for women's suffrage. It was really focused on that political struggle to have women in both England and the United States receive the right to vote. And there was all sorts of other things tied up with that, including a lot of the things that would be reprised in second and third wave feminism, involving cultural changes to how women were treated in everyday life, or economic changes to what kind of economic rights women had access to. But the first wave, really, the centerpiece of that was the focus on women's suffrage. And then that was won in the 1920s in the US and the UK. And then in a lot of ways, feminism goes into abeyance. It goes into eclipse in the middle of the 20th century. Or just to continue the metaphor, the wave has peaks and then there's these troughs. And why does it have this trough in the mid 20th century? Well, it has a lot to do with World War II, the aftermath of World War II, in which, as we already talked about, you have all these returning veterans, you have the GI Bill, you have the creation of the suburbs, and all of that's leading to a fairly male-dominated and somewhat culturally conservative atmosphere. And then in the 60s, you have the emergence of the second wave of feminism, which is a rebellion against this atmosphere, some of which, by the way, we glimpsed in this class, particularly, I think, in A Streetcar Named Desire, in the way in which Blanche Dubois was treated, especially as a person who, while, obviously a talented and brilliant person, she didn't really have any outlet for that. She just had to find a man and get married, and that wasn't just a character trait she had. That was more what the society was expecting of her. And then you have this swaggering male figure of Stanley Kowalski representing this post-war masculinity. So if you think of A Streetcar Named Desire as an illustration of what was happening in that trough between the first and second waves of feminism, you'll see what's going on. So then the second wave of feminism arises, and it's really, I would say, more of a cultural and economic movement than one that's directly political with a capital P. It was about how women were treated in society, and it focused on things like marriage and whether women sort of needed to get married to have economic independence. It focused on women's access to the workplace, to professions like law and medicine and academia and other learned professions that provide independent accession into the middle class. It focused on things like sexual harassment, which I think as a term was only coined in the 1970s, to broadening a concept of sexual assault and rape beyond the legal norm that had prevailed before that. So, for instance, the idea of rape within marriage was not something that was really focused on in before the second wave of feminism. And then perhaps more controversially, both at the time and today, the second wave of feminism was known for focusing on things like prostitution and pornography as kind of inherently oppressive to women and things to just be kind of extirpated from society. I'm overgeneralizing a bit, but that was kind of a characteristic of the second wave of feminism, which the third wave of feminism would actually want to reverse that and protest against that. And there's a lot of discussion around these issues today as well. So that's the women's liberation movement. And it just as on a little sub note there was a slogan that emerges out of second wave feminism that I think is very important and that informs the literature of this period, which is the slogan is "the personal is the political." And this refers to the idea that what seem like private issues, like, so it seems like there's this political realm where politicians in Washington, D.C. are making these decisions. And then there's this apolitical realm of the family, of the private sphere where you get married or not, and you have children or not. And that's private. And then this other thing in Washington, D.C. is political. And the feminist slogan, "the personal is the political," tries to break down that boundary, tries to show the ways in which what seem like private apolitical life are actually determined by political structures. So if there is a political and legal structure according to which, let's say, and I think this was a real thing in the middle of the 20th century, let's say you as a woman can't get necessarily an independent bank account from your husband, or your husband will have to co-sign if you want to get a checking account, so that's a political decision, but it alters everything about your private life. It makes it harder for you to get a job. It makes it harder for you to live independently of this domestic family structure. So the personal is the political. The ideas that structure society also structure the most intimate aspects of your everyday life. So that's a slogan we want to keep in mind. The personal is the political. And we saw, I think, that too. And so there have been glimpses of this movement stirring in the literature we've read before it. So Sylvia Plath's Daddy, which is about the oppression, the intimate oppression of women, and which the whole controversy really of that poem is that it's trying to link that to bigger political structures, which is why she compares her father to a Nazi. So that, this is a poem written before second wave feminism, but you can see how it's kind of foretelling it. So that's one. Then there's the civil rights and then the Black Power movements, and these are focused on the African-American struggle for liberation, and these are two related but slightly separate things. And again, I have to overgeneralize a little. There's a lot of nuances here that you can get into if you want to actually explore the history, but I'm just trying to give a big picture story. So the civil rights movement began in the mid-1950s and was largely a movement that pursued nonviolent resistance to end the legal system of segregation that was still in place in the United States, particularly in the South. So this was a movement, the one most associated with Martin Luther King, and it tended to have a religious inflection and a liberal reformist inflection, arguing that, one of the famous line from Martin Luther King's speech is he says, the Constitution was a promise to us that, all men were created equal and that there could be this equality and democracy in America. It was a check, and we've come to cash the check as African Americans because we've been excluded from this promise. So it sort of took this view of America as having this potential, but it was only flawed by these racist practices. That gives way in the later 1960s, after a series of events, including the assassination of Martin Luther King, to the Black Power movement and related movements like the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers. And this was a different movement. It was more separatist. It tended to reject that idea of nonviolence, and it asserted a black identity or a African diasporic identity that was not an American identity. And it tended to be radical and revolutionary as opposed to the liberal and reformist civil rights movement. It tended to see America as irredeemably flawed, as inherently structured by racism, and thus not able to be reformed. It was merely to be rejected. And so you have the civil rights movement, you have the Black Power movement, and those were other examples of social movements of the 1960s. And you have related movements that are structured around race and ethnicity as well in Native American and Hispanic and Asian American communities. And I do want to talk about those, but in the context, I think, next week of looking at the multicultural movements that develop out of the 1960s as well. So I'm not ignoring those, but I want to talk about those next week when we talk about some of the literature associated with those movements. Also, you have the gay liberation movement with the Stonewall protest in 1969, where that was a protest in New York City where the patrons of a gay bar were resisting the policing of it that was going on, because there were all sorts of laws in the middle of the 20th century that were kind of intrusive even to one's own person, as far as, you know, where you dressed as quote unquote a man or a woman should be dressed, etc. And so the Stonewall protest in 1969 kicks off this movement for LGBTQ rights. Not that that was a term used then, but that would gay liberation was really the term used then, but then, you know, other terms like queer and LGBTQ would come to the fore later. And I think that gay liberation and the women's liberation movement were connected, because there was just as you have in the African American liberation movement a reformist and a revolutionary wing, similarly within feminism you had a more radical separatist wing that said that essentially men's oppression of women was so deeply ingrained in all previously existing human structures that women simply had to kind of resign from these structures and form their own communities, and thus pursue what was called kind of political lesbianism. And so there was the famous slogan, "Feminism is the theory, lesbianism is the practice." And we have writings from around this period, like the poet we're going to read shortly, Adrienne Rich. She wrote an essay called "Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Experience," or lesbian existence, one or the other. The idea being that there's nothing natural about heterosexuality. It's kind of an imposition of the patriarchy to reproduce society through the subordination of women. And so once you are awakened to this, you'll see that feminism and lesbianism naturally go together. And so the gay liberation movement and the women's liberation movement are connected in this separatist ideology that I think also echoes the separatist strains in the Black Power movement. So what I'm saying here is these movements are quite radical, and in a political sense, that they're calling into question really the totality of the legitimacy of America as a state, or of most really Western or sometimes human history, as being irredeemably corrupt, and thus we just need to sort of begin again. And there are precedents for this in earlier radical movements. I think Marxists used to say, human history has not yet begun. We're really not yet human. We won't be human until we're fully equal. And I think we see the echoes in these movements. And then alongside these movements is the anti-war movement. So U.S. involvement in Vietnam begins in the 1950s, and then by the late 60s, the war had escalated with no end in sight. It was not clear how the war would come to an end. And I think one of the things fueling some of the total radicalism and rejectionism of this period is that was a fully bipartisan war. That, it was begun by the Democratic Party. It was continued by the Republican Party, Democratic presidents, Republican presidents. And so it did seem like the totality of the American establishment was geared toward this really proxy war where the Americans, and it's part of the Cold War, it's part of the fight against communism, and the idea was that America had to fight communism in Vietnam and in other countries so that it didn't sort of encroach upon the world. And yet, one of the important things about Vietnam is it's the first televised war. So we have to take into account changes in media. So television is developed in the late 1940s, enters American homes in a big way in the 50s and 60s. And then, so by the late 60s, families are sitting down to dinner, they're turning on the TV, they're watching the 6 o'clock news, and they're seeing this incredibly violent footage from Vietnam. So you see the televised violence that's turning the public, or at least large portions of the public, against the war. And anti-war sentiment also fueled the other protest movements of the 60s as well, with women's liberation saying this is male patriarchal violence. Black Power looking upon the Vietnam War as a case of a largely white dominant culture waging an imperial war against people of color overseas. And so all of these things are playing into each other. And so the anti-war movement is connected in that way to these other movements. So those are just the movements I want to talk about right now. As I said, there's some other and related social movements that we'll discuss later when we're talking about some of the literature that comes out of them. But for now, I think this is enough background to look at some of the poetry of Adrienne Rich and Lucille Clifton, to see what's going on in the journalism of Joan Didion, and also to see how Ishmael Reed's views are coming out of this as well. So with that, I now want to turn to before we turn to Adrienne Rich and Lucille Clifton, I said that I wanted to revisit one of the postmodern manifestos I asked you to read 3 weeks ago. So I said we'd read the postmodern manifesto section of the book, and then we'd look at some of them at later points. And so now I want to look at the one by Audre Lorde, Poetry is Not a Luxury. And Audre Lorde, as we saw in the headnote to this, was a Black poet, memoirist, writer, activist, who wrote about her experience of race, of gender, of sexuality, as a lesbian, of disability, as a cancer survivor. And so she is a writer who's very connected to the literature coming out of the social movements of the 60s and into the 70s and 80s. And Lorde has this text that they present as a postmodern manifesto called Poetry is Not a Luxury. And I want to read through this. They just give you these 2 paragraphs. And I want to think about why they put this in the section called Postmodern Manifestos. What is the relation between postmodernism and what Lorde is saying here and what we were just talking about with the social movements? So she says, for women, then, poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. Poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. The farthest external horizons of our hopes and fears are cobbled by our poems, carved from the rock experiences of our daily lives. As they become known and accepted to ourselves, our feelings and the honest exploration of them become sanctuaries and fortresses and spawning grounds for the most radical and daring of ideas, the house of difference so necessary to change and the conceptualization of any meaningful action. Right now I could name at least 10 ideas I would once have found intolerable or incomprehensible and frightening, except as they came after dreams and poems. This is not idle fantasy, but the true meaning of "it feels right to me." We can train ourselves to respect our feelings and to discipline, transpose them into a language that catches those feelings so they can be shared. And where that language does not yet exist, it is our poetry which helps to fashion it. Poetry is not only dream or vision, it is the skeleton architecture of our lives. So, in one way, that doesn't sound that postmodern, because postmodernism, at least in several of its incarnations that we've seen in the course talked about how we're living completely in this world of media representation and simulation, and we have no access to reality. Whereas Lorde is talking about the rock experiences of our daily lives. So she does seem to say that she has access, and women, she says women here, I think she's thinking it, also specifically in terms of black women, have access to this rock experience. But what is postmodern about this is that it posits language and then the ideas that language brings forth into the agent of political action that becomes the agent of change of the world, of the social world, of the political world, and of the personal world. And so poetry in this case is not a luxury. It's not something that you do to contemplate very rarefied ideas of conceptual philosophical ideas as we might find it in an Elizabeth Bishop or a John Ashbery. It is really a form of activism and a form of political activity and a form of change. But the thing that's postmodern, I would say, about this, the thing that makes this, or that justifies the Norton Anthologies calling this a postmodern manifesto, is the idea that you first bring change into being in the form of language, and then that language changes the material world. That's actually, I think, pretty closely related to the idea of Lyotard, that that we are sort of constructing concepts in discourse, except where Lyotard is kind of warning that we're constructing concepts in discourse and not to mistake that discourse and that language for reality. Lorde is taking the far more positive view that we bring about newer and better realities. So there's this kind of despairing vision of postmodernism. We're trapped in language. We're trapped in representation. I think we saw that in John Ashbery, for all the emotion and affect that was in the poem Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror. It still seemed to posit that we're sort of trapped in language and trapped in representation and can't really ever get out of it. Whereas this is an activist postmodernism. Yes, we live in language, but through living in language, we can alter reality into that open potentiality that we also saw in Paley and in Le Guin. So we might even think about putting it into the terms of there's I sort of hesitate to say this, but there's like a right-wing postmodernism in which we might put like Baudrillard and John Ashbery and probably Philip K. Dick, that, we're just sort of stuck with this world of illusion and we can sort of enjoy ourselves within it, but there's nothing really fundamentally we can change. And then there's this kind of left-wing postmodernism in Paley and Le Guin and perhaps Pynchon and Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich, where, the postmodernism is really sort of good news. We can live in this, what Lorde calls the house of difference. Because remember, Lyotard says we need to be, as we construct worlds and language, we need to be attentive to pluralism and to diversity. And so Lorde is calling, not that she's reading Lyotard, but she's evoking that idea of this pluralism in this world of difference, but we can create a better future. So that's the sense in which I think this is a postmodern manifesto. Language becomes the agent of radical social change, whereas previous iterations of political radicalism, previous iterations of left-wing thought, as I think I mentioned last week, wouldn't, I think, have stressed language or literature or poetry that way. They probably would have said it was a luxury and what you need is direct, capital P, political change. You need to change the government. You need to change the economy. But if the personal is the political, then poetry is not a luxury because language changes the world. So that's just one of the ways I wanted to show how some of the literature emerging from these social movements is related to what we were talking about philosophically last week and the week before in terms of postmodernism. And I think that comes out in the poetry of Adrienne Rich and of Lucille Clifton. So I want to turn to them now. So Adrienne Rich lived from 1929 to 2012. She was born to a well-off family. Her father was a surgeon and her mother was a pianist in Baltimore. And so she was raised kind of in the southern upper class, and her parents had a very traditional marriage. I recently read a detail that her father, when they got married, her father gave her mother a dress he had made, and she wore it every day, and she called it my uniform. So that's the very restrictive, domestic kind of 40s, 50s, mid-century environment that Adrienne Rich is growing up in. And she was raised a Protestant. Her mother was a Protestant, though her father was Jewish. And so she was always later in her life exploring this divided identity and was interested in this Jewish identity, which she also thought had been kind of suppressed as part of the suppression of women minorities within that mid-century culture. She was very highly educated at Radcliffe and made her poetry debut in the 50s when W.H. Auden, a famous poet, selected her book for the so there was a prestigious series published by Yale University Press where they'd published the first books of younger poets, and Auden was the judge for many years. He was a very famous Anglo-American poet. I think he also selected John Ashbery's first book of poems in the 50s. So he was really the kingmaker, as they say, in the 50s. And so she publishes this first book of poems, which is very formal, late modern kind of verse of the kind we talked about when we started the course. And she married an older professor, and she had 3 children during her early career. But in the 60s, she became involved, her and her husband became involved in the protest movements, the anti-war civil rights movements. And her work became more explicitly political, and she began to come into her sort of feminist consciousness. And she left her husband, who later killed himself shortly after that, and formed a partnership later on with the writer Michelle Cliff. And so she came into her sense of her sexuality, of her lesbian sexuality, as well as her feminist consciousness. So she really, she was focused on social change, on political change, and on personal transformation. And so the rest of her life was spent teaching and writing poetry, essays. She was an activist, and she died in 2012. And I think the Norton quotes a passage she wrote in 1984 of her self-definition. She describes herself as neither unique nor universal, but a person in history, a woman and not a man, a white and also Jewish inheritor of a particular Western consciousness from the making of which most women have been excluded. So that, I think, is the postmodern gesture right there. She does not believe in nor construct a grand narrative. She focuses on her own particularity, on the details of her own identity, which she says is not universal. And from that, she's trying to craft a more emancipatory, a more liberatory discourse, but not a universal one that would trample other people's particular identities, especially as they happen to be more oppressed than she was, because she was conscious of herself, I think, as oppressed, as a woman, as a lesbian, and as a Jewish woman, but also as oppressor, as a white, Southern, upper class woman. So she had this concept of her sort of divided position in this social field that was unequal and ridden by power that she wanted to contest. And that's what makes her, I think, also a postmodern writer, even though she seems far from the, at least in her most famous sort of 60s and post-60s work, seems far from the more rarefied philosophical concerns of a John Ashbery. So I want to look at what is possibly Rich's most famous poem in a moment, but I also want to note that writers like Rich and Lord did not only write about these things, but they tried to put them into practice. And not only, because remember, the personal is the political, so everything is political in their view. So they weren't just activists in terms of the the government and the political order, they also were activists within their world, within the literary community. And a good example, I think, is what they did at the National Book Award in 1974. So the National Book Award is a very prestigious book prize, literary prize, and they give it for a variety of genres. And I think Rich and Lord, as well as Alice Walker, an African American writer who I think is also in the Norton Anthology, I think there's a short story by her in there, they were, I think, all nominated for the National Book Award for poetry. And I think that Rich was the one who received the award, but they got up and they Rich read a joint statement on behalf of Lord and Walker and herself. And they said, "We, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, and Alice Walker, together accept this award in the name of all the women whose voices have gone and still go unheard in a patriarchal world, and in the name of those who, like us, have been tolerated as token women in this culture, often at great cost and in great pain. We believe that we can enrich ourselves more in supporting and giving to each other than by competing against each other, and that poetry, if it is poetry, exists in a realm beyond ranking and comparison. We symbolically join together here in refusing the terms of patriarchal competition and declaring that we will share this prize among us to be used as best we can for women. We appreciate the good faith of the judges for this award, but no, we don't want the award. We don't think that poetry is about competition. We don't think that giving book prizes to a woman here and a woman there undoes the basic inequitable structure of a patriarchal society. And we think that poetry is ultimately liberatory, emancipatory, egalitarian, democratic, and moves beyond a world of competition. And so the interesting thing here is that not just that they have these ideas, but that they apply them in the literary world itself and are calling into question the structures of the literary world as much as of any other world in which they're participating. And I think what I want to talk about next week as we go from this liberation literature, as I call it, to multiculturalism, I want to talk about some of the shifts in publishing, because we've also been looking at that throughout the semester, what publishing looked like at different moments and how that structured the literature that got published. And so I think they're at a moment of diversification of literature, that they're sort of skeptical of how far it's going. But my basic idea here is that they're applying these ideas to the literary institution as well as to the political and the personal realms. So now I want to look at what is possibly Rich's most famous poem, Diving into the Wreck, which gave the title to her 1973 poetry collection, in which a lot of her meditations on gender and the anti-war movement are in that. And this poem, it's not... So it's interesting. It is a little bit like John Ashbery's Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, in the sense that it is this kind of monologue of a speaker who's having an experience that seems to be an allegory for something. And so it's not a clear poem. It's not a transparent poem. It's a poem you have to do some work to interpret. And I am going to contrast that with some of Lucille Clifton's poetry that we're going to look at next, which takes a different approach to what a literature of liberation looks like, and seems to imply that a literature of liberation has to be much more plain speaking, has to speak to more people, and can't sort of indulge this highly, how do you want to put it, this very philosophical or allegorical or metaphorical poetic rhetoric. So this poem is, I think, it's symbolic or allegorical. In any case, the thing it's about is not the thing it's about. I mean, it's about the speaker literally getting in a scuba suit and going down into the water and exploring this wrecked ship. But that's a metaphor or a symbol or an allegory. These words don't all mean perfectly the same thing, but what I mean to indicate is the literal level of the poem. The speaker gets in a scuba suit and looks at a wrecked ship is not really what the poem's about. It stands for something larger than that. So what could that be? Now, as with John Ashbery, I don't fully know. It's not something that's fully explicable in the poem. The poem doesn't tell you how to read it. You have to figure that out for yourself. That, by the way, is the answer. Let me say this, actually. That's the answer to the idea that a radical literature has to be transparent and easy to read. Democracy isn't just sort of taking what you're given. You know, ideally, you have to rise to the occasion of democracy by becoming an active participant. So in that sense, I think this is more my personal opinion, but I think a difficult literature is not necessarily anti-democratic. There's the other way of saying it is that a literature that is not difficult is in a sense condescending or patronizing or doesn't expect enough of people. Now, this is a big question. We're not going to answer it here. I'm giving you literature that takes both approaches, and I think there's something to be said on the side of each approach. But I did just want to pause there to make the more difficult case, that there is a democratic aspect of difficult writing, in whether it's Rich or Pynchon or Ashbery or Bishop or whomever, that it's actually it's paying you the compliment of assuming that you can engage with something that is sophisticated and not just assuming that you can't. So that's it. Digression over. I want to read this poem, and then I want to make a few observations of what I think it might be about. So, diving into the wreck. First, having read the Book of Myths and loaded the camera and checked the edge of the knife blade, I put on the body armor of black rubber, the absurd flippers, the grave and awkward mask. I am having to do this, not like Cousteau with his assiduous team aboard the sun-flooded schooner, but here alone. There is a ladder. The ladder is always there, hanging innocently, close to the side of the schooner. We know what it is for, we who have used it. Otherwise, it's a piece of maritime floss, some sundry equipment. I go down, rung after rung, and still the oxygen immerses me, the blue light, the clear atoms of our human air. I go down, my flippers cripple me, I crawl like an insect down the ladder, and there is no one to tell me when the ocean will begin. First the air is blue, and then it is bluer, and then green, and then black. I am blacking out, and yet my mask is powerful. It pumps my blood with power. The sea is another story. The sea is not a question of power. I have to learn alone to turn my body without force in the deep element. And now it is easy to forget what I came for among so many who have always lived here, swaying the crenellated fans between the reefs, and besides, you breathe differently down here. I came to explore the wreck. The words are purposes, the words are maps. I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail. I stroke the beam of my lamp slowly along the flank of something more permanent than fish or weed. The thing I came for, the wreck and not the story of the wreck, the thing itself and not the myth, the drowned face always staring toward the sun, the evidence of damage worn by salt and sway into this threadbare beauty, the ribs of the disaster curving their assertion among the tentative haunters. This is the place. And I am here, the mermaid whose dark hair streams black, the merman in his armored body. We circle silently about the wreck. We dive into the hold. I am she, I am he, whose drowned face sleeps with open eyes, whose breasts still bear the stress, whose silver, copper, vermeil cargo lies obscurely inside barrels half wedged and left to rot. We are the half-destroyed instruments that once held to a course, the water-eaten log, the fouled compass. We are, I am, you are, by cowardice or courage, the one who find our way back to this scene, carrying a knife, a camera, a book of myths in which our names do not appear. All right, so that's diving into the wreck. Now, how has this been read? I'm not going to tell you I fully came up with this interpretation on my own. I'm going to tell you that critics have read this poem. When you read it in the context of Rich's other work, it becomes clear that essentially what's happening in this poem is we have this surface level narrative, or no pun intended, or this, there's a surface and a depth level narrative. So we have the surface level narrative that the speaker gets in her scuba gear, climbs down, goes into the wreck. But what is allegorically, metaphorically, symbolically, what is it? What it is the poet who wishes to have a radical understanding of the world has to explore the untold stories of history, has to explore the catastrophe that history has been for the oppressed, for women, for people of color, for queer people, for other marginalized groups. History has not been the story of, America's expanding freedom or the onward and upward progress of modernity, because they have been silenced, they have been victimized, they have been brutalized, they have been enslaved. And so the radical poet must explore the true story of this wreck. Not the story of the wreck, which is the self-congratulating narrative of modernity that says that it's just been nothing but progress, but the true story, the damage that was done, and the treasures that prevail. Because within the oppression of all of these oppressed groups, there has been resistance, there has been creativity, there has been culture, there has been the creation against the odds of beauty and of resistance. And so she also wants to see that as well. And she, as she climbs down into the wreck, she sort of learns to sort of investigate this and see herself in this wreckage. She says, I am the mermaid whose dark hair streams black. And mermaids, she's talking about the sort of figure of the mermaid on the prow of the dead ship, which is this image of women created by men for the purposes of men as they sail their ships to what? To enslave people, to carry out imperialism. And so she studies this image of it, and then I am the merman, the drowned victim of this. The speaker claims this identity that encompasses he and she and you, finally, and we. So the speaker becomes the collective we, the collective voice of this oppressed, submerged world that has been undone by the catastrophe of modern progress. And so that's what diving into the wreck, I think, essentially means. And what is the speaker carrying? Well, a camera. So that's interesting. So, modern media sort of seems to make available this opening up of the stories that were untold, of the voices of the unheard. Then there's the knife blade, which is interesting because the speaker later says, I have to learn to turn my body without force. The sea is not a question of power. So the initial investigation seems to go forth with the possibility of violence, which the speaker later basically disowns. That this will have to be a non-violent investigation. That violence is what produced the wreck. And then the Book of Myths, which is invoked in the first line and then in the last three lines, a book of myths in which our names do not appear. What is this? This is the official story. This is the canon of great literature and philosophy. This is America's self-congratulating narrative of progress, or modernity's self-congratulating narrative of progress, which probably also includes even forms of left-wing progressivism that excluded women and other marginalized groups. Okay, so this book of myths in which our names do not appear, that's the story of the wreck. But she wants to see the wreck itself, something truer. And so you have this postmodern gesture of saying everything we had taken to be true was a discourse, was a cultural construct. And like Audre Lorde, she seems to say, I can get down to the rock of experience. I can get down to something true and reconstruct it in language. But that language would have to be itself alert to the ways in which language just tells stories and makes myths, and can't and shouldn't be used to create this totalizing universal discourse that just recreates oppression all over again. And that, I would argue, is why the poem is so open-ended and so open to interpretation, because it's trying to avoid that mistake of creating another myth that poses as the absolute truth of reality. And so that, I think, there's a lot more we could do here with this. There's a lot of things that need to be explained in this poem, and maybe you can write a paper about it and do that. But that's kind of my high level view of what's going on in this poem, that I think is a kind of complicated symbol, metaphor, allegory for the coming to radical consciousness of the poet involved in these emancipatory social movements. So with that, I want to turn finally to our second and final poet of the week, which is Lucille Clifton. So Lucille Clifton lived from 1936 to 2010. She was born in Depew, New York, to a working class family who was very conscious of their African heritage, of their heritage as Dahomey people. And so Clifton often said that her mother would say to her, and she would say, we're from Dahomey women, so which was a West African kingdom. And so this lineage, despite the slavery that had incurred upon the Dahomey kingdom, despite the oppression of black people and black women in particular within the United States, there was this consciousness of a heritage and of a lineage that empowers Clifton throughout her life. And she attended Howard University, a historically black university in Washington, D.C., but did not end up taking a degree. She got married to this sculptor and philosophy professor, Fred Clifton, and with him had 6 children and worked at various jobs, I think, in kind of in government work through her 20s and early 30s, and begins publishing poetry in her 30s when Ishmael Reed, who's a writer we'll also study this week, who I think it had introduced her to Fred Clifton, he showed some of her poems to Langston Hughes, the great poet of the Harlem Renaissance from earlier in the 20th century. Though we think of him as this early, 1920s figure, he lived into the 60s and 70s, or at least the 60s. And so he was the first to publish Clifton's work. And then she becomes a very successful poet and a very prolific writer of poetry, as well as memoir and many children's books. So she's a very prolific and honored writer. She was Poet Laureate of Maryland from 1979 to 1985, during the period where she was teaching at St. Mary's College in Maryland. And then later, I think after her husband died, she moves to California and taught at UC Santa Cruz. So she, despite the fact that she does not herself have a creative writing degree, she ends up mainly teaching as a part of how she makes a living. So that shows, I think, something we've been talking about since the very beginning of the semester, which is the professionalization within the university of the creative writer. So that is an overview of the life of Lucille Clifton. As usual, I have a little passage from the Norton Anthology bio of her. She says, although a closer look reveals the subtle craft of her poems, for example, the slant rhymes, which are words that kind of almost rhyme, and the carefully placed repetitions, they appear deceptively simple. Their frankness and directness close the distance between poet and reader, especially when these poems are read aloud. Clifton emphasized the informality in her work through the lowercase letters she preferred and through her frequent omission of titles. The language of her poems reflects her identity. I am a black woman poet, she said, and I sound like one. So for Clifton, as is not really the case for Rich, there's I think a desire to communicate with a very wide audience, and communicate not necessarily by making one's language universal, because she doesn't do that. She roots her language in her identity as a black woman. But she's using the vernacular that a black woman uses, in her view. So that word vernacular, that's like the language of the common people. And so she is using vernacular, colloquial, everyday language that is inflected by her gender and racial, and I would add class identity, but that is also capable of speaking to a very wide audience. She doesn't tend to write poems that are densely and cryptically metaphorical in the way that Diving into the Wreck and some of Adrienne Rich's other poems are, or that are sort of densely philosophical in the manner of John Ashbery. Now, she does. There is also a way in which you can, abuse this insight and neglect the high intellectual components of some of her poetry, especially some of the poetry that was not included in the Norton. And that's interesting because Toni Morrison, the novelist we'll be reading in 2 weeks, or no, next week. Yes, next week. Toni Morrison wrote an introduction just in the last decade to Lucille Clifton's collected poems where she said that, critics were almost too dazzled by this idea of Clifton as a vernacular poet and neglected the intense intellectual and philosophical insights in some of her poems that were less discussed, such as one she wrote about Adam and Eve and her sort of take on the book of Genesis that are not in the Norton anthology. So just as I wanted to complicate the idea that Rich writing difficult poetry is not democratic, so I want to complicate the idea that writing vernacular poetry can involves necessarily doing away with some kind of philosophical or intellectual interest, which I think is not true, and I think can be its own form of condescension and patronizing of the poet. So these are, again, really complicated issues when we're trying to connect the language, the diction, the word choice, whether a piece of writing is difficult or not. When you're trying to connect that to the politics of the work, that's a really long, complicated conversation that I can only gesture toward. But what I really don't want to do is have us speaking in oversimplicities about it. That, oh, it's easy to read, it's democratic; it's hard to read, it's undemocratic. I think that's a I don't know, it's kind of a cheap thing to say, and I don't think it's true necessarily. And so I think that we want to keep that in mind as we're negotiating these concepts, especially with these poets for whom it's a question, because these poets are involved in these movements for liberation and emancipation, and I think want their poetry, as Lord says, to not be a luxury, to have some kind of effect. I think the problem perhaps doesn't occur in the same way to a John Ashbery, but nevertheless, it's complicated, and it's more complicated than you can get in a slogan. So with that, in the interests of its being complicated, I want to look at 3 of Clifton's most famous poems, because she generally tends to write very short poems, so we can look at a few of them. And I want to look at them. These are pretty famous poems, and I want to look at what they are all about. And you'll note again her use of lowercase letters almost entirely. She doesn't use capital I or almost any capital letters except for the occasional proper noun. And I want to read these 3 in sequence. So number 1, Homage to my hips. These hips are big hips. They need space to move around in. They don't fit into little petty places. These hips are free hips. They don't like to be held back. These hips have never been enslaved. They go where they want to go. They do what they want to do. These hips are mighty hips. These hips are magic hips. I have known them to put a spell on a man and spin him like a top. Okay, so deceptively simple, as the Norton editors say. There's nothing here that needs to be, interpreted just to be understood. It's a series of kind of declarations. She's paying homage. She's giving a tribute to her hips. But when you think about this in context, when you think about this in the context of what she's saying about women's bodies in general, about Black women's bodies in particular, perhaps even more particularly about working class Black women's bodies that have been regulated as to their sexuality, bodies that have been controlled as to their sexuality. And she's paying tribute to the sexuality of her body, and she's saying that this part of her body that has been sexualized is free. It's never been enslaved. It's powerful, and it's not petty. It doesn't fit into petty places. So whereas a normative standard of beauty that is centered on a kind of white upper class ideal of feminine beauty might prize a slim figure as most beautiful, Clifton reconceives trans values, overturns that to celebrate this largeness that is free, not petty, not enslaved, mighty, magic, and then finally at the end of the poem, sexually in control. Not controlled by a man, but sexually controlling the man, sexually powerful. So it's deceptively simple, but it's a powerful political intervention that reconceives how bodies are seen. Women's bodies, black women's bodies, working class black women's bodies become re-envisioned in this poem. And so despite its surface simplicity, it's doing this complicated intellectual work. I think we see the same thing in the second poem, Wishes for Sons. I wish them cramps. I wish them a strange town and the last tampon. I wish them no 7-Eleven. I wish them 1 week early and wearing a white skirt. I wish them 1 week late. Later I wish them hot flashes and clots like you wouldn't believe. Let the flashes come when they meet someone special. Let the clots come when they want to. Let them think they have accepted arrogance in the universe. Then bring them to gynecologists, not unlike themselves. So this poem is, I think, a little bit similar to Homage to My Hips, but it's first of all, the first thing to note about this poem is that it's supposed to be funny. She's reconceiving what she wants for her sons as what she sees women have to face. These physical challenges that women have to face that are wildly exacerbated by the society that they're in. That it's hard to get a tampon when you're in a strange town and there's no store nearby. That gynecologists are, at this point, almost all male and arrogant and don't take account of women's needs. So there's a kind of humor. There's a humor is always based on surprise. So a mother wishing her sons to suffer and to suffer in the way that women suffer. And then the punchline of the poem really is that her sons, though I'm sure she loves them, or maybe she doesn't, who knows? It doesn't matter. That's not part of the poem. That her sons, there's a melancholy in the punchline, which is that it's her tragedy to have birthed more men who will oppress women like herself with their casual arrogance and with their setting up of a society that does not exist to meet the physical needs of women. So again, it seems like a simple poem. It seems like a poem that has almost a kind of greeting card humor about the difficulties of the relation between men and women. And yet again, there's also this political intellectual intervention being made. You're being told something serious about society and the way in which the personal is the political. Now, on a slightly different note, I want to end with the poem Blessing the Boats, that I think was very important to Clifton because she titles one of her volumes of collected poems after this, Blessing the Boats. And she gives it a little designation that she wrote it at St. Mary's, so she was the professor at St. Mary's College in Maryland, and presumably that was near the ocean, and she saw the boats there, or the river. I don't know, I've never been there. But so the situation of this poem is the speaker is blessing the boats. All right, blessing the boats. May the tide that is entering even now the lip of our understanding carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love your back. May you open your eyes to water, water waving forever, and may you in your innocence sail through this to that. And so, and you can see those slant rhymes. They were talking about back and that. So it's a poem that, we have the repetitions, may the tide, may you kiss. So it's, again, deceptive simplicity that really conceals an intricate formal organization. So this poem also, again, it seems straightforward. She's sort of giving this positive wish to the boats and presumably the people they're carrying, to travel past fear, to have this positive experience of nature, and that they sort of get through, that in their innocence they sail through this to that, they get to where they're going, they have a safe journey. But I want to think about this also in terms of a poem that reconceives the relationship between humanity and nature and spirituality, because they're all together in this poem. There's not a division among them in this poem. The speaker gives this spiritual blessing to these human crafted objects and envisions them and wishes for them a harmony with the natural world. And I think that what we can think about there is how that's very different from a way of seeing humanity as being at odds with nature, fighting against nature, and a nature that has nothing to do with spirituality, that it's a secular society that has no connection to nature. And in this way, this is a very non-postmodern poem, I would say, because it has this vision of sort of holistic togetherness of the spirit world, the human world, and the natural world. And I think that if there's anything that is postmodern, it's kind of overthrowing that old view that maybe we saw in Pynchon's Entropy, that Callisto believed, of the heat death of the universe, that science basically revealed to us a godless, spiritless universe in which even our human works were doomed to run down to nothing. Or maybe a contradistinction too to the Adrienne Rich view of the sort of human-made world as this patriarchal imperial construction. And maybe it was, but does it have to be? Doesn't Clifton offer this more utopian view of blessing the boats in a world where the human, the natural, and the spiritual can all go together? And in this view, maybe the postmodern critique of oppressive, normative, modern progress clears the ground for a new vision of nature and culture that will be redemptive, that will be spiritual. And I think we're going to see that in some of the literature we're going to read in subsequent weeks, where there is a kind of initial postmodern moment of clearing the ground of those oppressive prior structures, but not sort of resting in the negativity, but instead building something new and constructed, in this case, in a vernacular language that sort of summons to the poetry a collective that can understand its words in order to absorb its political point to make a better future. So that is the way in which this, very differently from Rich's poetry, is a kind of literature of liberation. So I'm going to end there, and then I'm going to pick this up with Joan Didion and then Ishmael Reed to conclude this week's discussions. Thanks very much, and have a great day.